All right, today we're taking a trip way back to the 11th century. But listen, instead of just running through a list of dry textbook dates and facts, I want you to imagine something for me. Imagine I'm an incredibly exasperated medieval Muslim chronicler. Someone who had to sit there and watch this entire, frankly, absurd and deeply tragic historical saga unfold right in their own backyard. We're diving into the First Crusade in this explainer. And let me tell you, what you're about to hear is a wild story of monumental misunderstandings, some brilliant military strokes, and absolutely devastating consequences.
Because here is the ultimate question we really need to answer. How in the world did a disorganized mob of starving peasants, eventually followed by a band of opportunistic European lords, actually manage to conquer Al-Quds, Jerusalem, one of the holiest cities on earth? And you want to know the really painful irony of it all? They managed to pull it off while the Islamic world was essentially looking at a massive 5-alarm fire raging in their kitchen and deciding that was the perfect time to argue over who gets to wash the dishes. It's a stunning paradox, and it literally changed the course of history forever.
Section 1. The Pope, Byzantines, and a Golden Opportunity.
Okay, let's set the stage. Over on one side, you had the mighty Seljuk Turks. They had swept down from Central Asia, embraced Sunni Islam, and were basically dominating the entire region. Back in 1071, they totally crushed the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert and gobbled up most of Anatolia, taking over major cities with rich Christian histories like Nicaea and Antioch. But here's the kicker. In 1092, the great Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah died, and almost immediately his massive unified empire began fracturing into a million little pieces. Now, even though the Seljuks were falling apart, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos was still panicking over local warlords. So, in a fateful move in 1095, he wrote a desperate letter to Pope Urban II in the West, essentially begging for some military backup.
Now the Pope, he didn't just see this plea as a cry for help. Oh no, he saw a golden opportunity. He wanted to heal the massive divide between the Eastern and Western churches, and let's be honest here, he wanted to give his rowdy, violent European knights something to do other than constantly fight each other. So he offered them an unprecedented spiritual incentive. He said, whoever for devotion alone, not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God can substitute this journey for all penance. Think about that. He took deeply violent men who were absolutely terrified of hellfire and told them they could literally fight their way into heaven. The crowd went wild, screaming, Deus Vult, God wills it.
Section 2. The Disastrous People's Crusade. But here's where things get completely derailed right out of the gate. Instead of professional soldiers answering the call first, a French priest named Peter the Hermit inspired this massive mob of 20,000 to 40,000 ordinary commoners and peasants. And guys, they completely misunderstood the assignment. It started with misplaced holy zeal and almost immediately took an incredibly dark turn. Fueled by sheer prejudice, parts of this mob started off by massacring around 5,000 innocent Jewish men, women, and children in the Rhineland. It was a senseless, horrific slaughter that the church actually condemned, but couldn't stop. Then, this totally undisciplined mob started marching east. They ran out of food and hungry, so what did they do? They attacked their fellow Christians. They arrived in Byzantine territory and actually started pillaging the very allies they were supposed to be rescuing. The Byzantine emperor hastily shipped them across the water to Anatolia just to get rid of them, where the Turkish forces promptly ambushed and annihilated them.
Section 3. Princes and Muslim Disunity.
Now, if the story ended right there, it would just be a bizarre, dark comedy of errors. But while those peasants were being wiped out, the actual, real military muscle was packing its bags back in Europe. By December 1096, the real Crusader army began arriving at Constantinople. We're talking about 60,000 men. This was likely the largest army seen anywhere in Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And they were led by incredibly powerful, seasoned feudal lords. Remember, Emperor Alexios had just asked for a small band of mercenaries to help him out. Instead, a terrifying, heavily armored horde of 60,000 shows up on his front lawn, including a guy named Bohemond who had literally spent his entire life trying to attack the Byzantine Empire. The emperor immediately regretted sending that letter, and he forced them all to swear oaths of loyalty before he'd even ferry them across the Bosphorus.
So look at the stark contrast we have here. On one side, you have this massive, unified, heavily armored European force, with about a sixth of them being elite mounted knights, and against them, a deeply divided Muslim world. And honestly, putting my exasperated chronicler hat back on, it was just embarrassing. The great Celtic Empire had devolved into a fractured mess of regional Turkish rulers called Atabegs, and they were all too busy fighting each other. And when they weren't fighting each other, they were fighting the Shia Fatimids down in Egypt. Like I said, it was a house of bickering roommates, completely oblivious to the fact that heavily armed intruders had just kicked down the front door. Nobody over there truly understood the Crusaders' strength or what they were actually trying to do.
The Crusaders took Nicaea and started marching inland through the absolutely brutal Anatolian summer heat. Now, the Turks thought this was just going to be a repeat of that peasant mob they easily crushed earlier. So they ambushed Bohemund's vanguard at Dorylaeum, raining down arrows with their hit-and-run cavalry strikes. But the Turks quickly realized these were heavily armored knights. For hours, despite taking heavy casualties, the Crusader infantry lines just would not break. Then Godfrey's rear guard arrived practically out of nowhere, threatening to completely encircle the Turks. The Turkish forces panicked and fled. And man, this was a massive wake-up call. These knights were a completely different beast, and winning here allowed the Crusaders to basically march straight through Anatolia unopposed.
Although, not everyone kept their eyes on the holy prize. For some of these guys, the lure of wealth and power was just too strong to ignore. A crusader named Baldwin of Boulogne literally broke off from the main force, took a detour down south, grabbed some land, and eventually traveled to Edessa. Next thing you know, he installs himself as the Count of Edessa, establishing the very first Crusader state. He completely sidelined the sacred mission because he spotted some prime real estate.
Section 4. Betrayal and the Fake Antioch Miracle.
So while Baldwin was playing king, the main army pressed on. By October 1097, they reached the colossal city of Antioch. This was the final, massive hurdle before getting to Jerusalem. And the siege of Antioch? This is where the sheer, absurd historical plot armor of the Crusaders goes completely off the charts. I mean, they were stuck outside these impregnable walls, starving to death, dying of disease, freezing in the rain. They were on the absolute brink of total annihilation. So how did they survive? Just wait until you hear how a bribed guard and a rusty piece of scrap metal miraculously flipped the entire script.
Because they certainly didn't win through tactical military genius. Check this out. Step 1. Bohemond secretly bribes a guard to open a tower window in the dead of night. Step 2. The Crusaders pour in and brutally slaughter the city's inhabitants. But they couldn't take the inner citadel, so the Muslim forces held out. Then, Step 3. A massive Muslim relief army led by Kerboga of Mosul finally shows up and besieges the Crusaders inside the city they literally just took. The Crusaders are trapped and starving all over again. Step 4. A miraculous discovery. Someone digs up a rusty piece of iron in a church and suddenly claims it's the holy lance that pierced Christ. Out of nowhere, these starving, desperate men are filled with fanatic religious zeal, and they march out of the gates to fight. Step 5. And this is the part that would make any chronicler tear their hair out. Kerboga's massive Muslim army just crumbles. Why? His commanders hated each other so much that they actually accused him of treason, set their own camp on fire, and just went home. They literally lost purely because they hated their own allies more than they hated the invaders. Unbelievable.
Section 5. Jerusalem's Fall and an Epic Beginning.
With Antioch secured, and Bohemond casually breaking his oath to the Byzantines so he could keep it for himself, the path to the ultimate prize lay wide open. And the political irony here is just staggering. Down in Egypt, the Fatimids actually took advantage of the chaos and recaptured Jerusalem from the Turks in 1098. The Fatimid vizier hated the Turks so much he literally reached out to form an alliance with the Crusaders. But the Crusaders were like, no thanks, taking Jerusalem from you is the whole point of our journey. But right here, the humor completely stops. As the Crusaders marched south, their desperation and fanaticism led to unspeakable atrocities. At the city of Murat al-Numan, they committed a massacre of civilians so horrific, so brutal, that it permanently stained their legacy in the region.
By June 7, 1099, the Crusaders finally laid eyes on Jerusalem. Many of them just dropped to their knees weeping. But the reality on the ground was incredibly grim. Out of the tens of thousands who started, only about 12,000 fighting men remained. And the Muslim defenders had prepared brilliantly. They poisoned the wells outside the city, cut down all the timber, and drove away the livestock. The Crusaders were parched, standing in a barren wasteland. Yet you have to acknowledge their terrifying ingenuity. When 6 Genoese ships arrived on the coast, the sailors dismantled their own ships and physically carried the timber across the scorching desert, just to build massive siege towers. And then, on July 8th, seeking divine favor, This entire starving army marched barefoot in a solemn religious procession right around the massive city walls.
On July 15, 1099, the final assault began. Godfrey's forces managed to bridge their siege tower to the northern walls, and they poured into the holy city. And what followed was a profound, heartbreaking tragedy. Overcome by religious ecstasy and sheer bloodlust, the Crusaders embarked on a horrific, indiscriminate massacre. Soldiers, civilians, Muslims, Jews, men, women, and children, all slaughtered without mercy. For the Muslim world, the fall of Al-Quds was an unimaginable catastrophe, a deep, painful wound that would resonate for centuries. Against all logical odds, the First Crusade had succeeded in its sacred yet deeply bloody objective.
A month later, the Crusaders defeated a Fatimid relief army at Ascalon, securing their hold on the region. Having finally fulfilled their holy vows, most of the Crusaders just packed up their things and went back home to Europe. In the end, out of the massive hordes that began the journey, only about 300 knights remained behind with Godfrey to actually defend their fragile new kingdom. Oh, and the man who started it all? Pope Urban II died just 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell. He passed away never even hearing the news of this momentous, bloody victory.
And so 4 precariously fragile Crusader states were carved right out of the Middle East, completely surrounded by enemies. Jerusalem had fallen, but guys, this was absolutely not the end of the story. It was merely the bloody kickoff to a 200-year war. This monumental disaster was the ultimate shock to the system for the region. So the question we want to leave you with today is this: how would this catastrophic wake-up call finally force the divided Muslim world to wake up, unite, and push back? Well, that is an epic story of counter-crusades for another time. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the past, and we'll see you next time.